Good evening, all you intrepid folks. I live in North Carolina, where, too, the minute somebody even whispers the word snow, everybody goes to the grocery store, buys all the bread and milk and eggs, and they go home and don't go out until the sun comes out the next day. So I really appreciate your efforts coming out this evening. It was such an honor for me to work with the outstanding staff at the Walters Art Museum to bring to fruition this project. And I can sincerely say that the icing on the cake for this project was coming here to the Frist and working with really, I think, one of the best group of professionals who are also just consummate gentlemen and gentlewomen. You folks are very, very lucky to have such a spectacular arts organization here, and also a wonderful building. Just love the architecture. So without any more ado here, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the John Bourne collection, how it came to be, and first of all, who is this guy John Bourne? In 1945, when he was a young and foolish 19 years old, he joined an expedition that literally went into the dark and damp jungles of southern Mexico at a time when there was no electricity, there were no roads, there were virtually no people except for indigenous Maya, the Lacandones, who were the last group of Maya who intentionally kept themselves isolated from modern society. John was on this expedition, became friends with the Lacandones, and what John and his colleagues were looking for were old ancient Maya ruins. And so the Lacandones took him to this place called Bonampak, which today is one of the most famous Maya sites, famous for this little building that has 3 rooms inside of it with the surviving murals from the 8th century AD. This is the ancient name of the site of Bonampak. It's Utzwitz, which means Vulture Hill in Mayan. This is what the murals looked like back in the 1950s and the ensuing years. Terrible deprivation due to natural and human intervention, and we now have some really spectacular paintings made of these murals done by Heather Hurst, who won a MacArthur Award for her work and continues to do these replicas, and these are available here. I think that's on the website. Well, John then goes back to LA, where he was living, and he recognized early on in the late 1940s that the material culture of the ancient peoples of the New World is not just anthropological curiosities. These are not only objects of anthropological value for understanding history and chronology, that in fact these are great works of art. So he joined some of the earliest collectors in the United States collecting pre-Columbian art as art, such people as Vincent Price, John Houston, and Natalie Wood. As a result of his getting into the getting the collecting bug very early, he was able to acquire some spectacular works of art, objects that now, of course, because of legal restrictions, you cannot acquire, and also are simply no longer available. What he put together was a comprehensive collection that represents the artistic production and expression of peoples from Mesoamerica, Central America, and Andean South America. This comprehensive collection spans more than 4,000 years of culture history. The exhibition includes artworks from 37 separate cultures, and if you take the ellipse of the territory covered by the artworks on display upstairs, superimpose that over Europe, and compare the time depth to European history, it's the equivalent of art spanning the cultures from Sweden to Eritrea and from Pharaoh Khufu to Da Vinci, just to put this into a framework in terms of the comprehensiveness and the time depth represented upstairs. So tonight I'd like to explore a couple of themes that we find in many of the artworks of the ancient Americas. The first one I'd like to talk about is the sacred charter of kingship, where we'll look at Mesoamerica, which is Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, a little bit of Honduras, and El Salvador, and talk about the Olmecs, who are considered the mother culture of Mesoamerican culture during the first millennium BC. These are the folks who made the monumental portrait heads of their rulers. And this piece, which is on display, is the first object that pre-Columbian art that John ever acquired. He purchased it in a Chinese antiquities shop in Santa Barbara. It was being sold as ancient Chinese ceramic sculpture. John walks in and recognizes, oh my gosh, that's Olmec, that's from about 800 BC, and immediately acquired it. And he said, you would just cry if you knew what I paid for it. I probably paid about $5 for it. But in terms of the sacred charter, you'll see this incredible object on display upstairs, and you want to look at it and go, what is this thing? What does this represent? It's a very large piece of jadeite being the most valuable material in the eyes of the Mesoamerican peoples. Well, it's an axe. It's a big axe, basically larger than the actual axes that ancient peoples used. To clear the forest here to make milpa, but it is the quintessential form of the axe for chopping down the bush. So why has this got anything to do with Sacred Charter of Rulership? Well, it's actually not a tool. It's a representation of a tool in a very precious material and also a very large size. We find these often in ritual caches underneath buildings, underneath these caches that the ancient Olmec created that refer to religious ideology or concepts of the universe, cosmograms. And here is one such layout. They're almost always found in these cruciform shapes, these four-sided crosses with something in the center. So a kind of a quincunx form. Other of the axes of these celts we find are incised with imagery on them. And many of those images are representations of the maize god. And you can always recognize the maize god because you see, here's his eye and his nose and his mouth. It's a profile view. Here's his forehead. And his head has that cruciform shape. It's actually marking the four corners of the milpa of the cornfield. And the ground in the cornfield is split open, and a maize plant is growing out of it. So what we find in other kinds of artworks from the Olmec are, in this case, not the representation of the maize god on a celt, but in fact the representation in jadeite of a maize seed. Here's the maize plant to compare with the carving. So if we look at other pieces of Olmec art, here on the left is a representation of an Olmec ruler. And if we'll look at his headdress here, he has one of those sprouting seeds in his headdress, and there are actually 5 of these, and they're celt-like forms. And his head, part of his headdress, and there is actually a little split in his head here, and emerging from that is the head of the maize god. So what this image is telling us is that the king, when he is placed in office in his formal presentation, is like in kind to the maize god. Here's the king seated in the cave. Here are the maize plants growing. He's undertaking a ritual, and because of that, rain is falling and plants are growing. The maize plants are growing. So here, the sacred charter of these Olmec kings is intimately connected to the fecundity of the earth, of the reassurance through the proper ritual by the king in the reemergence of new plants in the milpa every year. There are other representations of the maize god. So we see here, and here, in this case, it's not the maize god's body, it's just his head. And here again are the 4 little maize trees, or the sprouting seeds, that are marking the 4 corners of the milpa. The maize god is in the center, and he's holding this, what we now know is a tree, or a bundle of maize plants. So if this is Kent Riley's drawing of what this would look like in 3 dimensions. So what we have in essence is a visual representation of the 4-sided milpa, which is a reflection of the Mesoamericans' view of the world as a 4-sided world. And in the center is the maize god. He's now standing up as a tree, as the maize plant itself, which is marking the center of the universe. He is the world tree. And on this other representation of an Olmec person, he's actually holding one of these celts, just like the one upstairs. So you can see that these things were held as a kind of scepter or a badge of office of the Olmec kings. This massive sculpture from Veracruz shows another Olmec king. He's seated, but notice that his leg is raised up. He's exerting force forward. He has grabbed the world tree or the celt, and he is wearing the headdress of the maize god with the sprouting maize plant at the top. He is ready to raise that world tree in the center of the milpa as part of these rituals of regeneration of life. So moving forward in time, let's go forward about 900 years. We're going to move from the Tabasco lowlands and go down to Oaxaca and look at some artworks from the Zapotec peoples that also continues this theme of the sacred charter of rulership. John collected 3 of what originally were 5 urns. These are urns, there's open here at the top, and then there's an urn at the back for placing offerings inside these sculptures. There's one very large one, and the iconography, the jewelry in this case that's being worn by this human male person is, in fact, this is the jadeite pectoral that identifies the maize god. And in his headdress, now it's not the maize god, but in fact, it's a representation of Pitao Kosobi, the maize god, and here of Kosillo, the rain deity. And then there are 2 other smaller sculptures that are here that came with this grouping that represent probably people who are personifying Kosillo wearing a mask of the maize god. So if we look at the archaeological context in which these are found, this is a tomb at Monte Alban in southern Oaxaca. And here we have the entire grouping. We have the main figure, the king, as the maize god in the center, and then the small attendants in the guise of the rain god or of other deities occasionally who flank him. So again, we have these little guys, the attendants marking the 4 quarters, or the 4 corners of the world, of the cardinal directions, and the king as the maize god in the center. Here's another representation. You can see he's holding a sprouting maize plant, and he's got a maize cob here in his headdress. We didn't lose, but John was not able to acquire all 5 of the pieces that clearly came out of the same tomb, but here, taking the 2 and reduplicating them, this is the cosmogram, in essence, that's represented by the king in his guise as the maize god and the sacred charter of rulership to ensure life on earth. Just to show you some new finds that just happened about a month and a half ago in Mexico. This is the site of Atzompa, which is actually part of Monte Alban. It's just kind of a neighborhood. The Mexican archaeologists have been doing extensive excavations in this building that is a series. It's like, I think they've got 4 stories inside there of superimposed tombs. And all these vaulted buildings, it's incredible. We've never found anything like this. And inside one of them, this is the most recent tomb that was opened. Here we in fact find one, you can see one of the 5 urns that were found in here. And the real interesting aspect here is the fact that this is the only one that we've ever excavated that has a lot of its original paint surviving. Keep in mind that a lot of these artworks that we have, that we see in museums, and even if they've been archaeologically excavated, they were originally very brightly painted, and that paint has not survived in most cases. But here we have an example. And in the galleries, if you look very carefully at these figures, you will notice that there are the remnants of the paints, but I thought I'd show you one and what it looked like pretty much in all its original glory. So moving south to the Maya area, and actually we're going to go east to just kind of straight east of Haina Island up here in Campeche. One of the most unusual pieces that John acquired is this stela, but it's not a big monument like we're used to for the classic Maya. It is in fact a miniature. These are extremely rare. I only know of 4 others of these that have survived, that are in the collections. One's in Merida, and the other 3 are here in Campeche in the museum. This monument, we're able to read the hieroglyphic text on it. It's a little eroded, so we do have some questions, but it depicts the ruler probably of the site of Waimil, Ishim Chantok, and it shows him on the front enacting a ritual. He's dropping, here you see his hand, he's dropping incense into an incense burner, and here's Ishim Chantok, here's his head. And by this ritual, what is happening is up here in the heavens, he is conjuring or bringing forth into our realm a deity or an ancestor, a sacred ancestor. And by doing this ritual, he is bringing the force of the divinity into the human realm so that he can garner that power to help ensure such things as continuity of rain so that the crops will grow. The hieroglyphic text on the back tells us about the various rituals that he's undertaking, including here at the end the 2 dates. The dedicatory date here is June 28th, 810 of the Common Era, and it's a stone binding ritual, probably a binding with cloth of this stela, and then the removal of the cloth as part of these renewal rituals. On the side then are the names of the gods who are conjured, presented here in couplet structure, which is very typical of all Maya ritual speech in ancient times and today. You can see, though, that we've got a lot of erosion that makes it somewhat difficult to get everything read specifically. But at the very end, we're going to be up in the galleries with a couple of colleagues of mine looking at this monument again this afternoon, because there's a question whether or not we can read the word Ushul, which means his carving. It is possible that we have the artist's name here on the monument, but we art historians and the epigraphers are still trying to determine if we can actually read that eroded glyph. So, looking or staying still with the Maya, but now moving from Mexico down to Guatemala, look at this very large burial urn, which, yes, it's a burial urn. It's the bottom half of one of these urns that there's usually a very elaborate lid, in this case with the maize god at the top, and elements that also refer to the heavens, and then the lower part, which has a very large open maw of a monster, so of a being. It's actually a shark-like figure, the eyes, the open mouth, and then an underworld deity emerging from the mouth. This is a burial urn, but it's also a model of the Maya concept of the universe, which has 3 parts: a heaven, the disk of the earth, of the 4-sided earth, and the underworld below. The underworld is not hell; it's just another place, and it has gods and architecture and geography and an underworld sun, just like we have here on Earth. In the center of this cosmogram, at the beginning of creation, the maize god raised the world tree and separated the sky from the face of the earth and the underworld from the bottom part of the earth. And it is that world tree that maintains the structure of the cosmos. It's also along that world tree that religious practitioners can traverse the various realms, and it's along that tree that the king will travel when he's undertaking these rituals and bringing sacred force, divine power into the world to affect human affairs. So our burial urn is the bottom half of the cosmogram. It's this part, and it's a representation of the underworld with what I think is the underworld sun emerging. And the message here is, it's the promise of resurrection of the soul from the underworld. We know from other pieces of pre-Columbian art, we know where the maize god raised the world tree and created the universe. He did it at Three Stone Place, which is up somewhere in the sky. This is from the Madrid Codex, which was painted sometime around AD 1400. Over here on the section of this pottery vessel, these are two of the gods of creation. They are dancing at the moment of creation. They're bringing life force into the world by giving their blood in sacrifice. And where is it happening? At the Three Stone Place. And here, this is the hieroglyphic portion of the hieroglyphic text from a big stone monument at Quirigua in southern Guatemala. Matt Looper deciphered the text. And what it tells us is here are two of the gods who were part of the consortium of gods who created the world. And what this text says is that they placed the stone, the throne stone, and that here we actually have the names of these three stones of creation where the maize god is the primary god of creation, raised the world tree. Going to Palenque in Mexico and looking at the tablet of the foliated cross, this is what it looks like. It's a tablet on the back of this building, or this little building, which is inside the bigger temple. I'll show you a drawing. The foliated cross is in fact a maize tree as the world tree. And it is adorned with the head of the maize god and all of the jadeite jewelry that identifies for us the maize god, just as the Zapotec figure is wearing this big jadeite diadem that helps to identify the maize god. And it makes sense. This goes all the way back to the Olmec, where they're making these objects of power that refer to the sacred duty of the king to operate in the guise of the maize god. They're making these sacred symbols of power out of not only something very precious, but something that is green. On pottery vessels, we have other representations of the maize god dancing when he sets the stones of creation. He wears this massive back rack that itself is a model of the Maya universe. This bird representing the sky with a sky band. This we call him the Wheats Mountain, but it's a mountain sign representing the earth, and then water symbols down here representing the watery underworld. In the center here, then, on top of the sacred mountain, this is where the maize god is carrying those stones. And in this case, because it's a jaguar, we know it's the Ish throne stone. So if we go back and look at John's stela, what we have here is a continuity of the sacred power of rulership. We have a king in the 9th century enacting rituals in the guise of the maize god to ensure the continuity of life on earth through the regeneration of maize in the milpa every year. So all of these large monuments at places such as Copan in Honduras, they're absolutely the same kinds of objects that have the same messages. One is 3 meters high and one is a ½ meter high, but the message is the same. So moving into Central America, I'd like to talk about another of the themes that we find in pre-Columbian art and culture, and that is the concept of shamanism. Shamanism is a world religion found everywhere among all cultures. All cultures seem to either go through a stage of shamanic belief and also keep elements of it in other forms of religion in these areas. Shamanism is based on the precept that an individual is able to transform him or herself into a spirit form, and in that form traverse to the supernatural realm, harness divine or sacred energy, and bring that power back to earth to do such things as foretell the future, ensure victory in war, and heal the sick. In Costa Rica and among the peoples here in Costa Rica and also into Panama, we find this sacred charter represented in many different ways. The challenge that we have for all of these artists, the challenge they faced throughout time is, how do you portray something that you can't see? So in this case, this is an incense burner from northern Costa Rica, and the artist is doing two things for us. One, he or she is representing one of the spiritual animal forms into which the shamans would transform themselves, and that is the crocodile. At the same time, this incense burner refers to the land of Costa Rica and, in fact, entire Central America. Central America is a very long, thin ribbon of land that is marked by and created by a chain of volcanoes. So in many ways, the large scutes on the back of the crocodile replicate that entire chain of volcanoes that is Central America. And in the case of the incense burner, when you throw burning coals and incense into the bottom part, put the lid on, all of the smoke emerges here out of the mouth of the crocodile, just as it does out of the volcanoes. Representations of shamanic transformation beings, in this case bat, and the duality also refers to the dual form of the shaman as in his or her human form and in his or her animal spirit form. The shamanic transformation, at least here in Central America, among many peoples, was aided by a couple of different ritual acts, one of which was the ingestion of tobacco snuff or of hallucinogenic powders. And this figure is holding a little snuff bottle to his nose. And one of the other very common transformation figures or forms is that of a jaguar. Sometimes an eagle or another of the raptorial birds. So you will find the form of these pottery vessels also referring to the shamanic forms of these religious practitioners. Moving to West Mexico, we also here find representations of shamans. And again, these artists are grappling with that same problem, that challenge of how do you show something that we can't see happening. Here, rather than more symbolic forms, what we find are figures that are looking inward. This person's focus is not on this world any longer, it's on the spirit realm. And this piece from Colombia, this is actually a little tray used for tobacco or hallucinogenic snuff. And I think you will agree that this is probably not an animal of this world. And even though this pottery vessel from northern Peru, one would say, oh, well, it's just a guy who's a warrior because he's got a shield and a club, and he's wearing a monkey mask. Well, in fact, it's a representation of a shaman, and we know that for two reasons. One, he's kneeling in a position or seated in a position that is consistent with a shaman in the midst of the transformation process. Shamans today take this exact same pose. And shamans also today, throughout Peru and Bolivia, they talk about, well, when they are transformed and are in the spirit realm, what they're doing is they are harnessing that sacred energy so that they can fight the evil spirits. They can fight the bad karma, if you will, that are the causes of disease. So this is a shaman, but in his warrior aspect. And two other pieces here in the exhibition show another of the processes by which shamanic transformation happens, and that is ritual, motion, and music. Here, this is a gold pectoral from Costa Rica. It is showing a man playing a flute and a drum, but also, if you'll notice, he is in the process of being transformed into his animal spirit form, and emerging from his head are they're serpents, but what this is representing is that shamanic power that he has acquired as part of his journey. Another of the elements that we'll find throughout our journey through the ancient Americas is the concept of feasting, but not just as everybody getting together and having a good party, but in fact the idea of feasting as an efficacious platform from which one can build alliances, can push forth a particular social or political agenda. We do this today, it happens in the White House all the time with the state dinners. That's what those things are all about. It's really not about spending all of our tax dollars, but it's about providing a really wonderful platform for our representatives to advance our political desires. Same thing is happening in Europe and here in the ancient Americas. This is a scene inside a Maya palace. This is the palace building itself. Here's the ruler seated on his throne. There are members of the nobility coming here, and we know they're going to be feasting because this guy's holding a drinking vessel, and there's another vessel filled with food back here. It's got a little lid on it, too. We find the representation of feasting throughout the ancient Americas. These are feasting vessels, or ritual feasting vessels from northern Peru. And in this case, rather than being beautifully painted as we find among the Maya, and the beautiful painting, the representations of historical people creates the prestige of that drinking vessel, in the case of Peru, either we get representations of supernaturals and of deities on the vessels, and or they're made out of precious materials. In this case, gold and silver. And of course, the peoples of South America, the ancient peoples, independently developed metallurgy, and archaeological research that's going on in Peru now is pushing back metallurgy to perhaps as early as 3000 BC. Among the Maya, the most valuable drink that could be served at these festivals, at these feasts in the palaces, was a drink that we know well today. It is, we know what the drink was because we have the contents labels painted on a lot of these ritual drinking vessels. This one tells us it's Yukib Ta'ut Om Cacao, his or her drinking vessel for frothy chocolate. This is a representation of a woman, a Maya woman, is in a 16th century manuscript, and she is making frothy chocolate. She is aerating the liquid by pouring it from vessel to vessel. And if you look at the shape of that vessel, you'll notice that it looks very much like this vessel. In this case, there's a removable stand. In this case, they've actually attached one, but the shape is rounded bottom and brown. What that represents is the quintessential drinking vessel that's still used today throughout Mesoamerica. Drinking vessels are made of gourds. And this is a 19th century, actually no, late 18th century chocolate drinking vessel from Guatemala. Beautiful silver work on it, and look, they're still using the gourd here, even in a very high status drinking vessel among the aristocracy of Guatemala. What we find then also in representations from the classic period is the artists are pushing the envelope of the expectation of the user of these pottery vessels. And also the vessels were given away as gifts, as a remembrance, as a kind of party favor that binds together the host of the feast and the guests who then take away this piece. So the artists are making these vessels as interesting and as beautiful as they possibly can. And one of the ways they did this that we find over and over in Maya art is that they make a gourd vessel. They're referring to the humble and the common drinking vessel, but they're doing such things as making it out of a different material. So on the one hand, you're going to think that this is a gourd vessel, but when you touch it, it's really cold. It's because it's made of limestone. And in the case here, you look at this and you go, well, it looks like a halved gourd, but gourds aren't that color. It isn't a gourd. It's a ceramic vessel that's then covered with stucco and painted. And in the case of the John Bourne collection, what he acquired was a carved gourd. But again, it's not a gourd. You look at it and you think it's going to feel like a warm, soft gourd, and in fact, it's cool to the touch and it's hard. It's very, very slick because it's made of ceramic. We have, again, the contents label, if you will, found on many of these pottery vessels. These are rollout photographs by Justin Kerr of cylindrical drinking vessels. And they tell us, again, that what was in these vessels was cacao. That's the ancient Maya word for this frothy drink made of chocolate. But cacao, written cacao, is the origin of our word cocoa. And this is the Aztec word for the same thing, chocolate, which is where chocolate came from. So those words are ancient American words that are now part of English. And in John's collection is a spectacular pottery vessel. This one, again, is Maya, but it's not a drinking vessel. This is one of the vessels in which the chocolate was produced. It was frothed in this very large vessel. And again, we know it was used for cacao because it says right here, his or her, in this case, it is his drinking vessel for chocolate, Lord Eek. And the text goes on then to tell us that he was the son of the Lord. This is Chakhal Mukui, reddening dove. We have no idea what, we can read these names, we can read Chakhal Mukui, we know it says reddening dove, but we really don't know what that refers to, other than the fact that it is the name of the father of the owner of this pottery vessel. And here on the side panels of the vessel, this is a representation not only of Chakhal Mukui, but if you look very closely here, there is a maize leaf. So again, we have members of the aristocracy in the guise of the maize god as part of the sacred charter of rulership. In addition to pottery vessels being gifts during these political events, these feasts that are associated with building alliances and other agendas, we find representations of the other kinds of gifts that are given during these feasts. And of all of the various commodities, the two that are consistently represented in these palace scenes are cacao beans, the beans from which chocolate is made, and bundles of cloth. We don't have any of this cloth surviving from Mesoamerica because it's, the area is way too wet and everything just decays, but we certainly have great traditions today among indigenous peoples throughout Mexico and especially in Guatemala among the Maya of fantastic textiles as an element of culture that conveys a person's social identity, tells us where a person was born and is living, tells us that person's responsibility in the society, whether they're a member of the Order of St. Francis or if they are of the Cofradia of St. Martin, etc. We're sure from these kinds of images that the same patterns were happening in ancient times among the Maya, but we just don't have the actual cloth surviving. However, if we go to South America, to the Andean region here in Peru and in Bolivia and also down into Chile, along the entire coast here is one of the driest desert regions of the world. There are many areas along the coast here where there has never been rain ever recorded in the 600 years since they've been keeping such records in this area. So as a result, you can see how dry this coastal area is. The Humboldt Current creates an incredibly rich marine environment for such things as crayfish, et cetera, but the land is completely arid. As a result, what we do have from the Andean region is the survival of many of the spectacular textiles that were created as early as 2000 BC. So this is an example of one of the textiles that's covered. It's a brocade that's covered with representations of one of the sources of the fibers, and that is the camelids, and in this case, it's the llama. John acquired a very large sculpture of a llama, but it's not an adult animal. It's just the cutest little thing. You're going to have to go look at this guy. It's a young llama, a baby. And when you look at him, he's just cocking his head, and it's like he wants to come over and check out what's in your purse. Like all llamas, they are very curious and really will kind of bother you a lot. But as a young animal, they're actually quite cute and fun. These are examples of some of the textiles. You can see, of course, the many different styles, and well as for those of you who are fiber artists, you will recognize immediately the various techniques that are represented here. These textiles carry social, political, and economic information. They are also used by the Inca and earlier peoples throughout Peru as a major type of gift that was distributed from the nobility to themselves as well as to other members of society as part of the process of creating alliances and maintaining a continuity of leadership, of rulership, and of community itself. Andean art truly is based aesthetically on textiles. If we look at such things as the murals, the wall decorations of Chan Chan in northern Peru, you can see that these motifs are mirrored exactly in textiles. And this is a man's coca leaf bag made of gold. And what did the artist do? Well, the artist, of course, replicated in gold the typical textile bag. So even the technique of loom weaving is at the heart of the aesthetics of the peoples of ancient Peru. In the exhibition here, we don't have any of the textiles, but what we have are such things as ritual drinking vessels that, like the Maya, because these vessels were used during these palace feasts, and you want to, on the one hand, honor your guest by providing beautiful accoutrements for the event, and you also want to laud your status by having nice objects of prestige and power to use for your service. These objects aren't just painted with images of animals or flowers or something like that. They are painted to represent textiles. They're painted to represent the most valuable commodity and artistic form among the ancient peoples in Peru. There's another vessel here in the collection where you can get an idea of the clothing types worn by the ancient peoples. A male figure here in the front wearing a long tunic, and there are two women on the side also wearing probably a long tunic and a wrap skirt underneath it, a really great dress. And each of them are carrying these ritual vessels. In this case, these vessels may not be for drinking, but they are probably for making an offering to the Earth Mother, Pachamama, as part of, in this case, in South America, it's not so much a sacred charter based on the maize god, because maize was not the primary foodstuff in South America. That was potatoes and quinoa. In this case, the primary focus of religious ritual was to maintain universal balance, the same goal, but by maintaining the balance of opposites. So throughout Andean society, there is a sacred charter of reciprocity and of community, not of the individual, but of community. And balance is maintained by pairing opposites. And for example, if you want to make sure that you do have rain, a sacred liquid, so that your crops will grow, you have to, so that your crops can get the nourishment that they need. Well, you have to make sure on the other side that the earth is also properly nourished with a sacred liquid, so that the earth can provide the sustenance and the environment for the plants to grow. And the way this was done in Peru was by feeding the earth, Pachamama, with another sacred liquid, life-giving liquid, which is blood. So what we find often in Andean art is the representation of what we call trophy heads. These are the decapitated heads of warriors who were part of this sacred charter. In their personal sacrifice, their heads, like seeds, and the blood that issues from the head are planted in the ground as a way also to to feed Pachamama. So I think these three people are participating in one of these rituals of maintaining the fertility and the sustenance of the earth and of humanity by probably pouring blood, perhaps Yama blood or human blood, onto the earth. One of the more exciting aspects of the John Bourne collection is, again, because he collected these things a very long time ago. And back in the 40s and 50s and even into the 60s, the aesthetic among museums in the United States and in Europe was that objects need to be restored to as close to their original condition as possible, because in this way the audience can better appreciate the aesthetics and understand the artwork. As a result, all types of artworks, from Renaissance paintings to arts of the ancient Americas, were what we see today, or we would interpret today as heavily restored. So in the case of the John Bourne collection, this, it was no different than any other that you would find any place in the world. Anybody who'd been collecting the arts of the ancient Americas. So we needed to make sure that these objects, on the one hand, were stable for travel, and number two, I and the conservators, Jessica Arista and Julie Laufenberger at the Walters Art Museum, wanted to also investigate the degree of restoration, try to remove as much of it as we possibly could. So we have published in the catalog synopses of all of the research that Jesse and Julie did. It's also available here on the website, so you can download the information as you're going through the galleries, or you can check out one of their iPads and take those through the gallery if you happen to be interested in issues of restoration. Also, as an art historian, when you're dealing with objects that do not have archaeological provenience or provenance, sometimes there are questions of authenticity. And through material science analysis, working with conservators, it's possible to address questions. Now, the very large Zapotec urn that we talked about earlier has a very unusual face. Quite unlike many of the other urns that are well known and that are, we know for sure are authentic. In fact, one of my colleagues was so upset about this piece. He said, "You can't possibly show that to the world because it's completely fake." And I said, "Well, I don't know. I mean, it's unusual, but you know, there are unusual works of art." So Jesse and Julie started working on the piece. And what they determined is that there are areas that are restored, especially here on the bottom, which is very typical of these urns. And this ear flare was not extant when the piece was found. And so they simply, the restorer simply made a duplicate and put it on the other side, which is what should be there. The conservators then were able to determine exactly where the original cracks were, and that the cracks are contiguous. They do fit together with the contiguous piece. And then once they were able to figure out where the modern fill or restoration was, they took samples for thermoluminescence dating, and they took 4 different samples from 4 different places, and those all came back within 150 years either side of the stylistic date of production. So what that tells us is that, you know, this is a very odd representation of a ruler from southern Oaxaca, but this is absolutely authentic. It is an unusual work of art. This kneeling Moche warrior from northern Peru is a pretty big guy, made out of wood. Now, of course, we know that wood does survive here in northern Peru because of the very dry environment. But I had never seen a big wooden sculpture like this from the Moche culture at all. I even talked to Chris Donnan, who from UCLA, who's spent about 55 years excavating in this area, and he said, "I have never seen anything of that size." I mean, I knew what it was. It's a very common type of sculpture representation of a kneeling warrior, but they're always in ceramic. So Julie and Jesse spent a lot of time examining this piece, working through various analytical techniques. And what they found out was that, on the one hand, the thermoluminescence dates on the on the wood. I think they took 6 samples out of this piece, and they came up with 2 dates, one around 1300 and the others clustered around 1700. So that tells us that this wood, some of it's ancient, pre-Columbian, but some of it's colonial period. Then they started looking at all of the metal pieces and the shell pieces and realized that all of these parts that are colored here in purple, those all represent manufacturing techniques, a variety of techniques that are not ancient techniques. So that tells us that these parts are modern additions. However, for example, right underneath here, underneath this shield, that the shield part itself is of at some point modern manufacture. Underneath it are corroded copper strips with pseudomorphs of textiles embedded in it. And pseudomorphs are the replacement of fibers of anything organic by, in this case, corrosion. That takes hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years to take place. So we know that a certain portion of this underneath here, some of this is of ancient manufacture. But in essence, our synopsis here is that, this wonderful figure that bothered me because of its unusual size, and we don't find this form in wood, is in fact a wonderful, an amazing pastiche of ancient materials and colonial materials. So this, in fact, is a modern expression of an ancient archetype. And just sort of here in quick closing, another example where we have a piece that's very unusual, this large conjoined couple. 2 things bothered me about it immediately, or 3 things. It's way too big for all of the conjoined couple examples that we have, and it's less than 10. It's actually not very many, so it's a very rare form as well. It's also, it was originally covered with a very dense black paint that might have been in a fired slip paint, but it was the wrong color. It was the wrong surface technique. And I have never in pre-Columbian art seen a sculpture where 2 people are actually engaging each other as if in conversation. So again, Jesse and Julie did extensive work on this piece, and the first thing they did is they removed the paint and found out that it was shoe polish. And yes, you're right, that's not ancient. But underneath it, they found this incredible fired surface, which is absolutely fine. Then they took the piece over to the medical school at the University of Maryland, and they did x-rays and CAT scans. So, and the doctors and technicians over at Maryland are really, really helpful, both to the Walters as well as to the Baltimore Museum of Art. They're always bringing over art, and when the CAT scan machine isn't being used, they're sticking in artworks. Well, in the process of looking at all of these different kinds of imaging techniques, what the conservators determined is that the piece is made from, it was originally smashed in hundreds of pieces, and there is a lot of restoration on it. However, in all of the places where restoration connects to real pieces and real pieces connect to other real pieces, in fact, as far as they can tell, this is the original form of this piece. So once again, we have just an extremely unusual artwork, and John recognized this as an amazing piece. He purchased this sometime in the 1950s. So his good eye and understanding of pre-Columbian art allowed him to acquire something that is a unique work, and not only unique in its style, but also brings another element of expressiveness of the ancient artists to our understanding of the arts of the ancient Americas. And even though these pieces have been, these conjoined figures have been interpreted as a marriage couple or an engagement scene, We now know from the horn that's on the head of the male figure here, based on shamans today in West Mexico who tell us that when they are in their spiritual form, in the supernatural realm, they gain a horn, and with that horn they are able to battle the malevolent forces that cause disease. So we know now that this is a representation of a healer and his patient. So the John Bourne collection, The Arts of the Ancient Americas, provides us a window into these cultures. Very, very charming pieces that refer to the role of women as the creators and nurturers of children of the next generation. We find abstract representations of things that you can't represent, such as Shamanic Transformation. This is a female shaman from about 900 BC in Mexico. We find representations of people, members of the aristocracy and of the haute couture and of the adornments that denote position and status. We find the actual jewels themselves, and made not only of precious materials but of very fine artistry that both in terms of jewelry, an ear flare from northern Peru, or the scepter of power that refers to the sacred charter of rulership. These are all represented in precious media that reflect the seriousness and the power of these individuals who wield these pieces. Other representations that are iconic that speak to us of the primary belief systems, the precepts of civilization, of religious belief, and of, in essence, scientific pursuit, understanding of the universe, both in naturalistic representations and also in highly abstract representations. Some of the delightful representations, the Colima, West Mexico version of the village people. And these intriguing figures. This guy is about 2 inches tall. He's really cute. That we have absolutely no idea what this represents. So we continue to be confounded but also delighted and inspired by these works from peoples thousands of years ago whose descendants are still with us today, and some of them are right here in Nashville. So it's really wonderful that the FRIST is also partnering with Latin American Studies, and they'll be bringing in some of the foods that also are the descendants of the ancient peoples, and so you too can have some chocolate drinks out of beautiful vessels later on this month. Thank you very much, and please go enjoy the exhibition. I'm going to go up into the galleries, so I'll be up there if anybody wants to ask any questions. Rather than me standing here and you looking at me, I'd much rather you go see the things. So thanks. I'll see you upstairs.